This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast, Spirit Matters Talk, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Welcome to the show. Thank you, everyone out there that's made a contribution to help keep us on the air. And anybody that would like to be amongst those that contribute, go to spiritmatterstalk.com and information is there. We have a wonderful guest back on the show. Dr. Roger Walsh. He is a medical doctor and a Ph.D. He is a professor of psychiatry, philosophy, and anthropology at the University of California. His research focuses on the topics of meditation, psychological well-being, wisdom, and our global crises. His books include Essential Spirituality, The Seven Central Practices, The World of Shamanism, and The World's Great Wisdom. And his research and writings have received over 20 national and international awards. He is a student, researcher, and teacher of contemplative traditions and an authorized lama in Tibetan Buddhism. Roger, thank you so very much for taking the time to come back on the show with us.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. It's fun to dialogue with you both.
Great to have you back, Roger. I will tell our listeners that we interviewed Roger in the early days of the podcast. And if you'd like to hear about his interesting journey in medicine and psychology and spirituality, I commend you to that first interview where he spoke about his history. But we want to stick to the present today. And Roger's involved with some very interesting and new work. Let me begin, Roger, by asking, as I said, you've been on you've been a leading figure, not to overly flatter you, but you've been a leading figure in this important intersection of Western psychology and the meditative traditions of the East. You've followed the research, you've done research for decades. What in the most recent period of time has impressed you most in the research findings? What is new? What's exciting?
Well, I think to my mind, the most exciting finding in contemplative practices and related disciplines is the recognition that adult psychological development can continue much further than we thought, and that psychologists now beginning to map out the stages of adult development along a whole line of areas from say moral development to cognitive intellectual development to emotional development to motivational development, faith development, and more. And I think that's really revolutionary, because we used to think that the mind more or less stopped growing when the body stopped growing. And yet we now have very clear evidence from a variety of fields that psychological maturation can continue through clear demarcated stages, far beyond conventional levels. And what we thought of the ceiling of human possibilities is really looking more like a form of collective developmental rest. And that has enormous implications, because it puts in very experimental and concrete terms the idea that there are potentials available to us, developmental potentials, that all of us probably have to a certain degree, those potentials to certain degrees, but in our culture it takes some work and some practice to realize.
Roger, you've been at it for quite a while in psychiatry and clinical psychology, those fields. And I'm going to guess that when you were a medical student, when you first started your practice, the receptivity in your profession was probably not nearly as great or as open as it is now. And has that been? And obviously, you've been part of that growing acceptance in these fields. But I'm wondering, has it been in the last 30, 40 years, you see it as a gradual growth, a gradual growth toward greater acceptability and understanding of contemplative traditions, of the human psychology being able to develop beyond what we thought it could develop? Or were there one or two things that happened that really accelerated that level of acceptance?
Well, probably a bit of both. And I should acknowledge that you mentioned that 30, 40 years ago, the psychological, psychiatric, medical profession wasn't as open to contemplative practices. Well, I was one of the people who wasn't so open to it. And I thought it was all spirituality was nuts. And the idea that I would
Great answer.
decades first in the future would be on a podcast like this
Right.
would have sent shivers down my spine. But I had the very good fortune of first moving from Australia, which was even more conservative, to California, which is not conservative, and having available to me the richness of this area, including the opportunity, which was really important for me, of being able to go into my own psychotherapy. And that was what really opened the inner universe up to me. And I realized that there was an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer. And I'd spent my entire life, it felt like living on the top 6 inches of wave on top of an ocean I didn't even know existed. And I think I was part of a larger wave of things that were happening. This was a time in the first in the 60s, of course, there were the introduction of psychedelics, but then in late 60s, 70s, there was the introduction of contemplative practices from the East into the West. So that was a major impact. Another one was the revival of Western contemplative practices and the recognition that, oh yes, our own traditions have these practices and these worldviews and understandings, but they've been hidden partly because these practices have always been the purview of a minority, but also because Western religion has not looked kindly on spirituality in many ways. And particularly when we think of institutionalized Christianity, but of course institutionalized Islam as well, even Judaism, all three of the monotheisms have had, for the most part, a dim view of contemplatives and their claims to, for example, unite with or have direct communion with the divine and to even merge with the divine in some cases. Those have been viewed as heretical. So all these things have played their role. And I think another thing that really shifted things was the sheer amount of research on contemplative practices, particularly meditation. There are now, I would guess, about 8,000 research studies out there. And, no one can keep up with it. I certainly can't. But it's really, it did not tell us, it still hasn't told us much about the practices and how better to do them. But it did serve to legitimize the practices. And for better or for worse, the Western science glommed onto the fact, they're brain changes, it must be real. So problems there, but still, it served a function.
Well, you mentioned problems. I remember the early days of the research. In fact, I was a subject in Herbert Benson's first study. So I'm a data point. But back in those days when they would find something correlated with a contemplative practice, it would come to define what the practice is and is for. So it became about changing brainwaves.
Right.
And that's how they defined it. Has it become more sophisticated? Are the people involved in the research these days and the people reviewing the research, are they more discerning? Do they recognize the larger picture of what meditative practices are for and what they can accomplish? Do they recognize the differences among those practices? And whereas in the past they used to mix them all together. Has it grown in that kind of awareness?
Yes, I would say there's been an increasing sophistication and understanding of the contemplative practices by researchers. And for the most part, there's still a ways to go. Taking your last question first, has there been a differentiation among the practices, recognizing they're not all the same? Yes, although it hasn't gone terribly far yet. But yes, we have data, for example, on differential effects of, say, TM as opposed to mindfulness, as opposed to concentration practices. The your point about the way in which measurable effects, such as brainwaves, come to or define the value of the practices, still has a certain ring to it. And in some ways, there was, for a while, there was much more information about heart rate than there was about heart opening. And so that still continues. However, one interesting shift has been there's a growing number of people who are doing research who are themselves practitioners. That I think opens people to a recognition that that there's much more to these practices than can be measured. As the saying goes, not everything that can be counted really counts. And that's certainly true of the contemplative practice. I would say that one of the lacks is still, there hasn't been a lot of research on advanced practitioners. So for the most part, it's still looking at the very valuable effects that people who do, say, a few weeks of practice or a few months, maybe a couple of years can get.
If I could ask you, Roger,
Please.
along those lines, what would you anticipate you might look for or find in those that are advanced in their practice of many, many years, maybe, and very deep in their practice? What are some of the areas that we haven't looked at that we should look at, or areas where we've seen change that we might see greater change, both subjectively, and in terms of, physiological changes?
Well, I think each of you could answer the question as well as I could about what are some of the experiential changes that occur in more advanced practices. But certainly it's clear that as people progress, they move from, say, if we look at, say the Buddhist practices of mindfulness, they move from resting just to keep a few seconds of the mind paying attention and actually aware of what's going on, and then getting lost in fantasies, to it becoming more or less automatic until eventually there can be continuous mindfulness. If we look at, say, the studies on awareness, say, one of the advanced practices, from the old traditions is lucid dreaming, being able to be aware that you're dreaming, and then extending that into non-lucid sleep. So now that there can be continuous awareness throughout sleep and continuous awareness through the day. So it becomes a continuous recognition that all this is that there's no loss of awareness or continuity both day and night, which is obviously that's very advanced practice. I think, let's see, Phil, would that be cosmic consciousness in TM?
Yeah, it would sound like it.
An aspect of cosmic consciousness, I would say that, yeah. But when you say throughout the day and the night, I also been trained along those lines, that's what they would be. And I know that actually they've been doing research on people that claim to have those experiences, and I think they are. I couldn't tell you the detail of what they're finding, mostly in regard to brain activity, but they are finding some unique stuff.
Well, they're quite interesting findings, Dennis, and what they show is the slow wave rhythms of deep sleep, but superimposed on those are more rapid rhythms associated with wakefulness. So it is a kind of alert sleep, right, just as is claimed. And most of that research has been done on TM practitioners, not all of it, but most of it, yeah.
Roger, before we drop the subject of the research, I want to come back to the first thing you said when we asked what was so most exciting. You talked about the discovery that there are levels of development beyond what we thought was normal or possible. Are the criteria or the parameters to define those levels of development, are they well accepted? Are the procedures reliable in the scientific sense? Is there any suspicion that people doing that research want to find higher states of development, and so are in fact constructing studies so they can find it? How acceptable are those procedures for uncovering higher levels of development?
Well, it's a new field, and it's really only emerged in the last few decades. And we should contrast this, Phil and Dennis, with contemplative practices. With contemplative practices, we talk about stages of development and contemplation, but those are actually successive states of consciousness that are being cultivated. And what we're talking about here in Western psychology is the recognition that not only states can change, but actually the kind of almost the operating system of the mind can change. And so that we not at each successive stage of development, and we can talk about childhood development just as well as adult development here, at each successive stage, the background processing of experience and input and creation of self-sense, etc., radically shifts. And we know that, we see that in children, that's very obvious. The changes in adults are more subtle, but they're definitely there. So although the field is new, there's a significant body of research that demonstrates, for example, in moral development, people go from pre-conventional, which is very egocentric, to conventional, in which they operate out of what is, what's my culture say, what's, what's good and bad, etc., to a more post-conventional or individuative reflective, where people begin to actually reflect and decide, is it really true that, that men are, should be, deserve better placement in the world, blah, 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 blah. So many things that were conventionally accepted only a few decades ago. The first people to question those were people at post-conventional moral levels.
Right.
That's pretty well established. There are other things like, but the further you go in development, the smaller number of people. There's a so-called what's called pyramid of development. That the further the development, the smaller the number of people that reach it. So when you look at the more remarkable, or truly post-conventional, let's call them trans-conventional stages, there the data begins to thin out. And so that's not so well established.
Roger, I wanted to mention to our listeners and to our viewers, because we are on YouTube channel now also, that along with John Dupuy, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, you co-host the podcast Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit, which is among the top 5% of English language podcasts and has listeners in over 100 countries. Tell us about that.
Yes, and tell us how you got all those listeners. We're jealous.
Well, we have people in about 50 countries, but we're missing 50 countries somewhere. Yeah.
Well, I suspect a number of those 100 countries are a handful of people. So,
yeah.
So let's see. Yes. Well, thanks for mentioning the podcast.
We'll have that, the website, how to get to that, how to find that podcast. We'll have that posted up. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, we share very similar aims as your podcast. Your work on spirit matters is that's a central part of what we're interested in. We were concerned, we look around the web and the quality of what's on there, that with a depth of analysis and discussion is very disturbing. So we were really interested in bringing greater depth to an exploration of particularly spirituality and the application of spiritual depth to the great issues of our time. So we focus on bringing people, probably a significant overlap with your guests actually, people who have real contemplative depth and tend to be looking at how to apply that to the issues of our time. So we're really trying to bring some depth in. And of course, we also look at, have the practitioners look at contemplative practice themselves. And again, there's a big overlap with your work there.
Roger, the interest that your podcast has in the intersection of, we could say, spirituality or contemplative practice and the issues of our time. It's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on when we saw about the podcast. This is a terribly important subject, and we've had other people on talking about it, and Dennis and I have been concerned about it for a long time. Do you see in your interaction with the spiritual communities a growing sense of that we do have some responsibility, that it's not all about our own personal inner development, and that we are also citizens? Is there a shift that is discernible?
Oh, I think there clearly is. There's been, in my experience anyway, just a growing recognition of the enormity and urgency of the crises we're facing. And that if we take a big picture, we have this godlike technology and this Paleolithic brains, and we have a mismatch between our power and our wisdom and other spiritual virtues. We've sort of become like the sorcerer's apprentice. We have enormous power, so we've become nuclear giants and technological wizards. We still remain ethical infants and wisdom children at best.
Right.
And so clearly we have an imbalance between our psychological, spiritual maturation and health and the technological powers. And our technological power is so great that the state of the world now is really a reflection of the state of our individual and collective minds. And so what we call our global problems are actually, and global and social problems are actually expressions of our individual and collective psychological and spiritual dysfunction. So I think there's a growing recognition of this and a growing sense of the question that all of us are facing of what can I do? And that, I think, is becoming one of the cons of our time for contemplative practitioners, looking at, okay, well, all these practices are valuable, and yes, and there's enormous value in doing them and cultivating our heart and mind and soul and spirit, and how can we apply it so we preserve this wonderful planet and heal our divided societies?
In the world of medicine that you also function in, psychiatry in particular, are your colleagues fairly receptive to your work, and do you have a lot of colleagues that are working with you, or do you feel some isolation that you're hoping that they catch up with your thinking?
Well, there's always some people in the medical world who share our concerns, but it's a distinct minority. The medical profession is selected for people who are hyper intellectual and really work ridiculous amounts of time, so they're kind of very focused on what they're doing in their world. And there's, I have to say, one of the disappointments of having been in academic medicine is realizing that, while there are individuals who are certainly doing, just so many people doing wonderful work, and for the most part, the vision is kind of tunnel vision, and not a lot of attention to either social global issues or spiritual issues. And again, with wonderful exceptions.
Right.
And in the other world that you travel in, are you finding blowback from people in the spiritual communities who would say that's all illusory and we shouldn't be involved, and that we should be unattached from the events of the world and the foolishness of human beings, and focus exclusively on our growing spirituality and our sense that we are something beyond these personalities caught up in dramas and so forth?
Actually, I'd say I see more of the opposite side of that. I haven't personally seen that much blowback about people saying, no, we shouldn't focus on social global issues. we should just practice. There are always those people who really just focus on practice. But I would say, if anything, what I've seen in spiritual communities is if we look at a balance or between going inward for spiritual practice and cultivation and going outward for social and global contribution. I sometimes feel concerned that communities get too lost into the social work side of it. As Mother Teresa said, we're not social workers. Well, when the world is so troubled and there's an ocean of suffering and time may be short, it's very understandable that people would say would focus, want to focus more and more of their efforts on contribution and social activism. But I hate to see it at the cost of practice. Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested in your experience. You interview a lot of people in this world.
Well, I think Dennis and I would both agree that there's been a welcome shift toward taking seriously our responsibility as citizens, and that it's not enough to just sit on the cushion and assume your good vibrations will heal all the troubles of the world, but that we are involved in the world whether we want to be or not, and so we should behave responsibly. Right. But there is also the opposite, and I agree with you. There's a zeal on the part of many a karma yogi, so to speak, to change the world and neglect their own inner life, and that renders them less effective than they might have been, and they probably end up often in seeing one of your colleagues about burnout.
I want to just throw out here and maybe a final question and comment for me, and that is that along those lines that you were just saying, Phil and Roger before you, to keep that, the importance of keeping that balance. And reading about Roger, you're one of the more interesting people I've ever encountered, and I've encountered, especially on this podcast, a lot of very interesting people. Your background is very diverse. First of all, you're an authorized lama in Tibetan Buddhism, but along with that, you had careers as a circus acrobat, and not long ago graduated from the San Francisco Comedy College and went on to an extremely brief, and I won't say unsuccessful, but you said that.
It was unsuccessful.
Stand-up comedy. But just the fact that you have pursued that sort of thing and done that sort of thing really impresses me, because often people who discuss what we discuss, other people look at and think you're living on some cloud. You're out of the. No, you're very in there. Right? What could be more on earth and more solid and than being a circus acrobat?
Well, that wasn't very solid. Tell us a little bit
about how you managed to do all these things.
Let's see. Well, first off, how did I manage to do all these things? First off, I've had a very fortunate life. I've been very blessed. I've had all the blessings and privilege that come with what the Tibetans would call a free and well-favored life, free of all the hindrances that can get in the way of one's spiritual practice and one's livelihood, and favored with all the circumstances that can allow one to proceed. And I've worked hard at things. And being fortunate with having meeting successes at various times. One thing leads to another. I think I would like to say I've been playing what I call the Buckminster Fuller game. And Buckminster Fuller, as you know, was one of the great creative inventors of our time. I think he had something over 1,000 inventions to his credit.
The geodesic dome, yeah.
Yeah, and but in his youth, as a young man, he got very depressed and suicidal. I don't recall the details of it, as I recall the details of the story. He actually contemplated suicide. At one point, was standing on a bridge, just contemplating the possibility of throwing himself off. And he asked the question, "What would make life really worth living?" And the answer he came up with was answering the question, "How much good can one person do?" And he's a perfect example of that. And so I think I just take that as a beautiful challenge. It's like, okay, we have this one precious life. How can we make the most of it? And how can we contribute most effectively? And it's been he has been a wonderful inspiration, and which I just feel great about. So, yeah.
So did you study doing stand-up comedy so you could reach more people than?
Well, actually, I thought it would be good for me because I was somewhat uptight and took life seriously.
It's great therapy. It's very,
well.
I mean, imagine,
Yeah,
I love stand-up comedy. It's very difficult. And it really puts people through stuff. Yeah.
It's funny that it came up because I started watching this. We're recording this at the end of May 2022, and there's a documentary about George Carlin airing on HBO. And I was watching it, and it occurred to me that he was one of the funniest people ever, and had a very big social impact because he addressed important issues in an extremely effective comedic way, and probably changed a lot of people's thinking and mind. Yeah. So we'll look forward to you, Roger, doing that. In the meantime, one of the things.
Well, Phil, can I tell you one story?
Yeah.
I took that as a kind of inspiration. Could you use comedy to have an social impact on people? So I did a routine, for example, on U.S. foreign policy. And after I completed my course, they videotaped the presentation. I came home and showed it to my late wife, Frances Vaughan. At the end of my routine, there was this silence. And then she said, well, actually, you're more of a preacher than a comedian.
That's great. You have an essay or an article online called Contributing Effectively in Times of Crisis. A lot of people are asking those questions. We have a few minutes left. Can you give the listeners and viewers some of the guidance that is in that article about how to discern the best contribution and how to go about it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the invitation, Phil. Well, the first thing is, when we look at any or all of the great issues we look at, the first reaction most people have is, oh, they should do this, or they should do that, or that, someone should make that happen. But if you keep looking, it always comes back to the question, what can I do? That's where it always ends up, because that's the only place we can influence things. But there are a couple of other questions that go with that. That's a wonderful first start. And the second question is, what am I moved to do? Because each of us is affected most intensely by different kinds of suffering, and each of us feels a passion about responding in certain ways. And we're much more likely to be effective and endure if we go with our passion. So that's the second question. And then there's a third question. Not only what can I do, but what's the most strategic thing I can do? Given my circumstances, the people I know, the skills I have, what can I do that would really make a strategic difference? How could I trim tab and multiply my impact in some way? And then there's a final question, which is the big long-term one. How can I mold my life so as to be an optimal instrument of service? And that's a lifelong question. And it's important to know what kinds of questions these are, because there are two very different kinds of questions. There are the usual questions, which are knowledge questions. Is it raining outside? Look out the window. End of question. But wisdom questions are more like koans. Every time we ask them, they have the potential for taking us deeper into the question, deeper into ourselves, and deeper into life. So these questions, what can I do? What am I moved to do? What's the most strategic thing I can do? And how can I mold my life to be an effective instrument of service? Those are wisdom questions, and they take time, and they bear repeated asking, and hopefully we'll be asking them for the rest of our lives. So those are questions for all of us, to sit with and be with. And the answers will change over time as we change over time. The answers will deepen as we deepen. So, and the questions can deepen us and render us more effective. So that's the first thing I would say. Would you like some more? Or
yes.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So there are several things that's really helpful to know if we're to respond effectively. One is it's helpful to know, for example, how people respond in times of threat. And unfortunately, under threat, most of us regress psychologically. We become more egocentric, we become more tunnel vision, short-term thinking, what's in it for me, or my family, etc. And that's, that's our kind of Paleolithic and before conditioning. But it's not very helpful for dealing with complex crises of the kind of magnitude and complexity we're dealing with. So then the question comes, is there a way we can help people not only not to regress, but to progress? And it turns out there are. If you give people 3 things, then they are much less likely to regress and more likely to respond effectively and contribute to it. The first thing is people need a context, a way of understanding the situation. So for example, with oh my God, we got all these crises we're facing. Yes. Well, one context would be, yes, civilizations always currently face crises, and what has worked in the past is for a creative minority of people to acknowledge the crisis, to come up with creative solutions, and then to communicate to the larger community about them and bring them on board. So that's just one of many contexts or ways of understanding the crisis. The second people need, in addition to a context, is a purpose, something that could be done. So just pointing that something can be done. The third thing people need is actually something concrete they can do, because the research is crystal clear. If people see a threat that's facing a group or some like, then if they can't see how to respond, they'll back off, and it may even demean the victims. But if they have a way, they see a way that they can respond effectively and relatively easily, or then they're very likely to be contributory. So that shift, giving people some sense of understanding of what we're involved in. So it's not just, second, a purpose, like we can make a difference. And third, here's what each of us can do. That is what enables people to actually contribute effectively and not regress. So that's another thing.
Very good.
There's more. How are we doing on time?
Take the last couple of minutes and give our listeners the word.
And this essay, all of this will have any of these articles, whatever, we'll have posted up as well as the interview itself. So, but go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think the last thing I'd mention then is something that you are both very, very familiar with, and your podcast has dealt with, and that is the practice of karma yoga. That is, if we need to cultivate ourselves to be more effective instruments of service, and if we need to be actively involved in the world, it would be really wonderful if there was a practice which could combine both. And as you both know, and as you both may popularize, there are these practices in the practice of karma yoga, the yoga which uses our work and action in the world. And when we do karma yoga, we go into ourselves, we go deeper into ourselves in order to go more effectively out into the world. And we go out into the world in order to go deeper into ourselves. And this is the cycle that Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, found was characteristic of those people who had most impact on human well-being, that they had gone through this period of withdrawal into themselves for a period, wrestled with the great issues of life and their times, and then come back to share what they had. And so karma yoga, the yoga of work and action in the world, really has a core place in my mind to play in spiritual activists contributing effectively.
And we need as many karma yogis as we can
We sure do.
muster these days.
We do, and thank you for your role in fertilizing the ground and
Oh no,
and
we do it for the money, Roger. Where this podcast is a gold mine. If only, right? Well, by the way, we talked about your podcast. Please mention the name of it again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Phil. It's Deep Transformation, Self-Society, Spirit.
Yeah, and you can go to www, and we'll have this posted, deeptransformations.I as an igloo, O as an Oscar, so .io. And you'll find it there. We'll have all of this posted up, articles, whatever. It's been an absolute delight having you on, Roger. And we have to do, this is part 2 of your interview series, and we're looking forward to part 3.
Well,
So
thank you very much.
out there, keep us on the air. Our podcast is free and open to the public. We are not a nonprofit. People do not donate to us, but if they want to contribute, they can do that, and we deeply appreciate it, and we will continue. Thank you so very, very much.
Thanks, Roger. Stay in touch, and we'll look forward to your ongoing contributions. Take care.
Phil, Roger Walsh, back on the show, psychiatrist and also a Ph.D. from Australia, now living in the U.S. And, really a trailblazer in his field. And how did you first become familiar with Roger? How did you first come to know him?
Actually, I knew his late wife before I met Roger. She was a psychologist as well, and she wrote a groundbreaking book on intuition. And then when I was writing my book on intuition in the 80s, I did my research and ended up meeting Francis, then met Roger because he was very much involved in he's one of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology, as was Francis. And they were leading figures in the integration of the spiritual domain and Western psychology. So I was very familiar with his work before I met him. And
your book, by the way, The Intuitive Edge, am I right?
Yes, thank you very much.
I enjoyed that book back in the day. Yeah, I was in a graduate program in clinical psychology, I believe in 71, 72. And I was practicing TM back then. And anytime I brought it up, I might as well have been from Mars, because it was really looked at like, they were respectful, but no one took any of that seriously at that time. And thanks to people like Roger, things have changed. And right now you can speak to any psychologist, any psychiatrist, and mention meditative practice and TM, whatever, and they're wide open. They've heard of it. They often recommend it.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't an easy path.
Data speaks.
Right.
Data, reputable journals, reputable people signing on. I now live in the Berkshires, hence for our regular viewers.
Yes, the new background.
Just when I was here in the early 70s, there was a psychiatrist named Margaret Brenman Gibson.
I knew her.
Who worked.
Her husband was a playwright.
Her husband was Bill Gibson, the playwright. And I knew them pretty well. And she was at Austin Riggs, famous mental institution here, and quite a prominent psychiatrist. And when she got into meditation, and her husband did, she became very enthusiastic and was one of those people who was touting the benefits of these practices at a time in an arena where the reception wasn't always pretty, and She
Right.
had some great stories.
I knew her as well, and very outspoken, lovely, lovely person. Her husband wrote The Miracle Worker, I believe,
Yes.
and also wrote. He was when I was on my teacher training TM course in Lantia, Spain. He was there, and he wrote a book or a play. I think it was a book, A Season in Heaven. Not.
It was a book.
Huh?
It was a book.
Yeah, book back in the day. Lovely people, but yes, she was all
Bill
by
Gibson
herself.
gave me some very important writing advice when I started wanting to be a professional writer. He told me to do what he did at first. And I asked him what that was. And he said, marry a doctor.
That's funny. They
That's,
were friends. By the way, just an aside, has nothing to do with anything, but they were good friends with Mel Brooks and his wife Anne
Yeah.
Bancroft,
Yeah.
and they took a trip together and told me what So anyway, but another fellow from that era was Dr. Gluck at the Hartford
That's
Institute
right.
of Living in Connecticut, who was one of the first again to introduce meditation as a therapy, as a way of dealing with certain types of stress, depression, whatever. So now it's very commonplace, but it wasn't back then.
No.
And yeah.
And the early people like Roger and the ones we just mentioned, there was, it took courage to speak out about one's,
Right.
even just to have an interest in such things. It was just, it seemed off the wall. It seemed quasi-religious to secular people. And
I love how Roger has led a very how he's experimented. He tried stand-up comedy, he tried circus, acrobatics, and all. It's a lot of fun. Very integrated guy, and and it was interesting what he said also when I asked him about the lack of receptivity for what he was doing back in the day. He was one of the people, he said, that had a lack of interest or thought it was all crazy, when he heard about meditation, that sort of thing. So obviously he evolved. He came to understand that. And also his interest and study in the area of higher states of human development, beyond what psychiatry and psychology have been dealing with over the years, that one can actually evolve past that, and there's new areas to go into. So
and methods, ways of cultivating those higher states of being. I mean, that all started, you could say, probably with Maslow back in the 60s. He had that insight that there was more to human development than we appreciated, and set the groundwork, I think, for a lot of the subsequent work.
Humanistic psychology, and really going beyond Freud, beyond Jung, well, actually Jung also was very, very insightful in the collective consciousness. There's a lot of stuff they deal with and are talking about now. There are probably new names in the field that I'm not familiar with.
Oh, I'm sure.
Doing great work in this area as well.
Ken Wilber, who I know Roger's very close to, he's done so much groundbreaking work and continues in that integral field of integral theory. And every once in a while I get a mailing, and there's a reference to some researcher or some theorist, and I'd never heard of. So there must be a lot of stuff.
I actually last month I met with Dr. Fred Travis. He's associated with the TM movement, and he's doing research, mostly brainwave and other neurological stuff on higher states of consciousness, what have traditionally been called higher states of consciousness, to see any I followed it to a certain extent, and then the science went beyond me. But it's interesting that they're doing that kind of research.
That's why I dropped out of graduate school. But the other important thing, I think, to be taken from our interview with Roger, and one of the main reasons I wanted to have him on the show, was his interest in and concern about the state of the world and what people who are living deep inner lives can do about the outer world, and that's terribly important, I think. And we've hit on that theme many times on the show, but it can't be emphasized enough.
Many times, many people, Marianne Williamson and many others, and you know, it's May 24th, 2022 that we're recording this, so we're still in the thick of COVID and what's going on in Ukraine and other horrific things in the world. And you know, the solution is probably not economic. It's probably not military, although all these things get involved. And there has to be, I think most people would think, a spiritual answer, and at least an exploration of making spiritual growth, development, the potential for higher states of consciousness available or knowledgeable. People understand that so that they can aspire to that, because, you know, the old story, if you want to change the forest, you got to change each tree. And hopefully our show shed some light on that and give some inspiration and optimism at a time when it's very difficult to be optimistic.
And I hope it also gives some inspiration to people who are serious about their spiritual lives, and the recognition that we have responsibility for the world. And Roger has some very good guidelines for how to discern and think about what you can do to help.
Right. I think back in the day when we got involved in meditation, you in the late 60s, me in like the early 70s, when people heard about meditation, when I heard about a meditation, you thought of somebody becoming more reclusive, if not going into a cave, going into an apartment on the Upper West Side and turning off to everyone and everything else. But that doesn't have to be that way.
No, but the temptation is very strong. And I did it. You know, I was a student activist. I was very active politically. And then I discovered spirituality, and all I wanted to do was get enlightened. Right. And, you know, I tuned out in a sense. And, but then, you know, in time, you grow up and you realize
one of the things Marianne Williamson brought out when we interviewed her, and others have brought it out, that some of the great social activists that have really made change, like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, I mean, they can, and Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa, they were based in a spiritual tradition.
That's right.
They were spiritual people, and that was the foundation upon which they stood to bring social change, and we need more of that now.
Yeah, and the more the merrier. The more, as we said earlier, the more karma yogis there are. There are more people who are genuine yogis, who have a rich inner life, who are developing, if not living in, those higher states of development. We need to bring those assets into the public arena, even if, you know, whether it's just, you know, helping out in your neighborhood, or, you know, running for office. Somewhere you find a way to make a contribution, as we are, Dennis.
As we are. And I want to mention, because Phil won't, his 3 most recent books, American Veda, don't miss it. Great book. You need that background. His biography of Yogananda that came out about a year and a half ago, and also what is it for crazy times?
Spiritual practice
for crazy times. And these are crazy times. And Phil now in Western Massachusetts. And if you don't know anything about Western Massachusetts, listen to some songs by James Taylor. So he often sings of it. I'm in Iowa, and I'm headed to Sweden. And it doesn't matter where we are in the world, we can connect. Roger was in Mill Valley, California, I think today. And so, but we want to, we have listeners now from all over the world. If anybody, I want to say this, May 24th, 2022, if you had trouble getting to our website in the last few days, we've had some technical things we're working on. We still exist, we're still here, and we'll be available. Our website, our archives rather, free, open to the public. Our shows free and open to the public. We're not a nonprofit, but if you want to contribute to help keep us on the air, and I want to thank the people who have, and we've had several, you can go to spiritmatterstalk.com. And once that's back and functioning, the website.
Well, actually, it's apropos that you should say that, because if we have some budget, we can avoid technical difficulties.
Exactly. We're operating on a cosmic shoestring or something like that.
Okay.
But
All right, Dennis.
All right, till next time.
Next time from Sweden.
Yeah, something like
Okay.
that. Right.